So what we're looking at is an ink blot from the standardized, and it is a standardized test, the Rorschach test, which is a psychological evaluation that is intended as a measurement tool, and what it measures is unconscious motivations in the evaluation of images, and this is supposed to give insight and information regarding one's, relationship to let's see how to put it, standards of normativity and psychological, emotional, image-related responses that that can be used to, if not diagnose, suggest bits of evidence that lean towards categorization of an individual psychological subject in domains that relate to standards of normativity, and the degree to which one exceeds the boundaries of that normativity or that psychological stability of the heroic middle, and some of those areas that that can be perceived of as in excess of the domain of normative psychological development and habitation, can be described in various ways, and there are categories such as schizophrenia, schizoaffective, neurosis, and most of these categories, as we've discussed many times before, are begin in the 19th century, and they begin with very different ideologies, than we have today, and even though the discourse, the scientific discourse, has changed dramatically, the categories, interestingly, haven't changed along with it. So, whatever was initially believed to be the responsibility for these conditions is now rejected, and the current medical model is to find some either genetic or predisposition in chemistry in the brain to explain variations in human behavior and actions that have these 19th century descriptors, and the reason that we're looking at this is actually this image and this this test is actually now interesting. This is an online version of the test. Before I go on, this is an online version of the test. So if a psychologist or a psychiatrist were actually implementing this test, you wouldn't be given a multiple choice and say, fill out the paper, does this represent one of these things? So the evaluation is tailored to the fact that we're interfacing with this test as an online heuristic, right? So you would actually just describe to the psychiatrist what you see. You wouldn't be given these options. Interesting, we have color one here. But the reason that we're looking at this test is because I've been discussing economy, and I've been discussing art making, and I've been discussing the intersections of economic life, and there are like micro and macro economic intersections of resources with our lives, right? And on the micro level, your economics, can be determined by by what's available in any given moment, and on the macro level, with the conditions under which you exist in the society and that society's positionality or position within the global economy, right? So that your conditions, if you live in say Yemen, might be different than if you live in Chicago, but your conditions in obtaining resources can be different if you're on the micro level, if you're a firstborn child as opposed to a second, third, or fourthborn child in a family of say 6, right? So all of these variations on various level and strata still represent, because anything that has to do with access to resources has to do with economy, and that can be economies that are defined by state, nation, system of and level of economic development, late capitalism, agrarian, tribal culture, etc. So, and the various ways that, we're never just one thing, right? All of these are, you could say, positionalities of economy that interface in complex ways. Anyway, I've been discussing some of those relationships, particularly as they pertain to the creation of art and the way that they intersect with aesthetics, both ideologies of aesthetics and just the ability to practice and continue to make and store, right, as well, store information and creations that one makes, and the way that as a developmental process that art learning and art developing and art evolving also depends on access to resources and the availability of both materials and information regarding the way that materials can be used, and of training and education and all of this. So the reason that we're looking at this, I can begin with a narrative of material loss and how the collection, right, and the keeping of collections and the storage of art materials and the documentation of art materials belongs to this realm of resources and economy. So as anyone familiar with my work now, my more recent work will realize, a lot of what I do is documenting the past, sort of retrospectively or retroactively, and in the process, creating, some new work, and I use the visual and the audio-visual recording capacity of a cell phone, which is a Mac, an Apple, to make these videos and to make these recordings, and to make movies. I call them movies or films, even though the material isn't a plastic emulsion that runs through a screen projector. But to me, the aesthetics of what I make, belongs certainly to the materiality of the devices, that I make them on, but also to a long tradition and history of cinema that's largely filmic. So whatever one calls them, I make them on my iPhone. All right, so the iPhone that I use costs about $1,000, and I bought it a couple of years ago, and I'm not good at remembering numbers and names, so I can't off the top of my head identify it, but it has quickly become outdated and become a problem. Now, I don't use it to communicate, as a phone or anything other than as a tool for making art. In that sense, it's a resource, and it costs money. And because I'm limited in my ability to to spend, and my resources are economically limited, I can't buy a new iPhone every year or every 6 months. So now recall, this is only about a 2-year-old iPhone. But for whatever reason, the applications that I use to create these images and films, I'm going to continue to call them films, even though that will raise eyebrows in some circles. For whatever reason, it saves data, or believes that it's saving data, but the data that it saves, once I delete, for example, a movie that I've created on the iPhone, unless I delete the entire app, the application with which that I've created it, it stores it somewhere, and eventually it runs out of room and won't allow me to create more film and more visual imagery until I actually delete the entirety of the app itself. Because like I said, I can't seem to, I'm trying to click continue here, but okay, here we go. But for some reason, I cannot simply remove the data. I can remove the data so that I no longer have access to it on the iPhone. But the iPhone's memory or mind, if you want to give it, presume it has the intellectual capacity to make decisions about the way that it presents itself and organizes information. Its mind doesn't recognize the fact that I've deleted the data, or that the data is no longer available to me. Now, whether the machine itself is sending the information to Apple, which very well could be, because it constantly requests that all of its material be sent to iCloud. And it also turns on and performs weird sorts of information gathering without permission. For example, on the iPhone that I have, there's a health application, and what it does is it records your movement and your location in space and time, right? So it records the time and where you are and how many footsteps you've had. And for some reason, this application just turns itself on and records these things, and spends a lot of its available data recording things that I have no interest in. And then you know, I'll occasionally like find it and I can erase it, but I can't remove the app from the iPhone. I would like to remove that app from the iPhone, but it won't permit that. Anyway, so we're talking about this because it costs $1,000. It's a resource for making art. It's a tool, and in a certain sense, it's designed for self-destruction. And what I mean by that is, so recently I reached the limit of data that I have, or the data storage that I have for my ability to create these pieces, these materials with this machine. And like I said, because I can't remove the data that is attached to the app somewhere in the ether, and that the app recognizes as storing, even though I've erased it from those areas where I'm able to access the data. In order to go on and continue making art without buying a new $1,000 iPhone, I have to reload the app. I have to erase the app entirely and reload it. But because the technology has changed over the short amount of time that I've been using the application, I'll have trouble either completely unable to reload the app, or I'll be able to reload it, but parts of the system will no longer be available. For example, there's a filter on the iClips that's called old film that I really like to use to filter some of the visual imagery that I create. And recently, when I ran out of storage space and I had to reload the entire app because I couldn't convince my iPhone that this material that it's claiming is taking up all the storage is in fact, deleted. I tried to reload this iClips, and that particular filter no longer exists for my iPhone, right? So I've lost it. So a lot of my work over time has experienced loss in this kind of way due to, because of lack of resources I'm unable to store. Now, storage itself, you can store things in, for example, there are businesses, right, that are devoted to storing your stuff, and you pay them a certain amount of money. You pay them $100 to $500 a month, and they store your things. But if you don't have the resource to pay for that, then you essentially lose out. You can't keep that. So an iPhone that costs $1,000 is a resource. So you begin by buying a tool, and then storage is also a matter of resource. And a lot of the reasons that I've lost things are because I don't have the resources to store them. And this example of the iPhone is just one of many examples of that, right? So continually, because of this problem with the interface of the new technology and the applications that comes out, and the failure of the machine to recognize my need for storage, I've had to erase data. And right now I have no data, either on the phone or on my computer of the imagery that I've created over the last at least 2 years. So and getting rid of that data is a decision. Like, do you want to go on making art? And if you do, like, you either have to pay more money for storage, which I can't afford, or you have to get rid of your old stuff. So I put everything up in my storage space right now is YouTube, but of course it's political, my work is, and so there's always a threat that it'll be destroyed for some other reason, or that a vindictive, and this happens often enough. Your work is either stolen from someone on YouTube, or a false copyright claim is made, and for example, I've had work of mine that has music that I created on it and visual imagery that I created, and still will receive a copyright claim, and still someone will find a way to put commercials on my work up, in spite of the fact that it entirely belongs to me. So the reason that we're looking at these Rorschach images in relationship to the economics and the resources of storage and of tools and of making and materials as well, right? Like one makes economic decisions about what kind of painter wants to be based on resources as well. For example, oil paint is very expensive. I've never been able to afford oil paint. Early on, I wanted to be a painter. Occasionally, I did work in oils, but often I would have to find ways of using other materials, whether they were acrylic or just household products. I've used, I've used shoe polish in paintings. I've used regular household chemicals, bleach. I've used old fabrics and found objects. I've used all types of materials to substitute for expensive paint in work that I've done, and sometimes found materials. You find materials on the street or in a garbage can or whatever, and this again is part of the economics that belongs to art making, and so I was thinking about all of this, and one of the results of getting a new application of iClips is that some of the, as I mentioned, some of the filters are no longer available to me. For example, old film is no longer available, but some new filters are available that I hadn't, used before, that weren't on my version of this this tool, this application as art making tool, at least for me. And one of these is a filter called Mirror. And it produces these, out of whatever image that you put into it, it produces these mirror symmetries that might remind one of a Rorschach test, which it certainly reminded me of a Rorschach test, but also reminded me of some of the depictions, particularly, through Terence McKenna, of what Terence McKenna refers to as machine elves or self-transforming elf machines. And these self-transforming elf machines, as McKenna has experienced them on ayahuasca and DMT, he describes as these this intelligence that that is a greeter. First of all, a greeter that welcomes you and is extraordinarily friendly. He hints at, but doesn't explicitly emphasize that it's a collective consciousness, and he describes them as makers and as encouragers of making. So they're in a way like art teachers or instructors or mentors, and he describes these entities as encouraging one to do what we're doing, make what we're making. And I don't take hallucinogenic drugs or other kinds of drugs, but I have had an experience with, and I don't know what I would call them, but a collective entity that is a greeter. And in certain ways, my experience with this collective entity, psychic entity that is a greeter is very much like Terence McKenna's, and in certain ways not. His machines and geometric, light and sound entities sound very mathematical, and mine weren't, particularly mathematical at all, and the context was very different. So I'll explain, what that context was and why, that this new app, this Mirror app, reminded me of these, both his and my version of these machine elves or whatever greeting entities we might want to call them. But my experience didn't begin with taking hallucinogenic drugs or having that type of psychological experience, but began with the fact that I was in jail in Flagstaff. And the reason that I was in jail in Flagstaff is because I had intervened in someone's violence, directed toward an animal. This man in a motel, in the room right next to the room that my wife and I were staying in, had a dog, and he was harming the dog, and the dog was crying and protesting, and so I intervened, and then and this white man, had a weapon. He had a gun, and then so I had to deal with that, and then anyway, long story short, this was my fault somehow. No one got hurt. I didn't kill anybody or whatever, but when the police arrived, I was arrested for. It was interesting because the charges at that time were attempted trespassing, which wasn't trespassing at all because I was staying in the motel. But I guess that the idea of the trespassing was I had violated the man's space who was beating the dog, I guess I had violated his right to beat his dog. I was informed that it was his dog and he had the right to do with it whatever he wanted. And when I mentioned that a gun had been drawn on me, then I was informed that this was Arizona, and so if I didn't like having a gun drawn on me, I should go back to California where I belong or whatever it was. And so anyway, later on, after I was released from jail and I had to return and stand trial or whatever, no one showed up to say yeah, I was beating my dog, but he took away my gun or whatever. But that's why I was in jail. And so I was in jail in Flagstaff, and then I was released, and I didn't have any money. I was when I was arrested, it was the middle of the night, and I didn't have my wallet. It was my sense of the urgency of it was go save the animal's life, and not let's put on all our wallets and information in case we get arrested. So when I was released in Flagstaff, I was released without any resources. Once again, right, we're talking about economy, and then you have to find a place to sleep, you have to find food, and I had to figure out a way to acquire the resources that I needed to return to California. And I tried hitchhiking, but no one would give me a ride. So I'm resourceless, and I don't have a wallet, and I don't have identification, and I'm wandering around Flagstaff, Arizona, and I wander out of Flagstaff, Arizona, kind of into the wilderness, or whatever you want to call it, mountains around the area, and I'm wandering in the forest among the pines and the prairie dog hills, and then I kind of spend some time there, and then I return a little bit towards the town, and there's a little park kind of at the edge of the town, and it's a very wild park, and but there's a path, there's like a trail through it. That's why I'm calling it a park, because there's a trail. So it's not entirely wilderness, right? It's not entirely free of human architecture, architectonics, and structure. And in this park, I'm sitting in this little grassy area, among these flowers, and these entities, these intelligent entities, start speaking to me, and they and they're greeters, and they say, and it very much is like what Terence McKenna refers to in relationship to the self-transforming elf machines. It's like, oh, you're here. We're so glad to see you. We can hardly believe you're here. We're so glad to see you. We hardly ever see you anymore. And the sense that I had in the conversation with these entities was first that they were collective. That it wasn't like the way that you would speak to a person, one person. Like it wasn't one entity saying we for the rest, but like this collective voice. So they were collective intelligence, and then I had the sense that they were very small in a certain sense, and yet or small individually, but perhaps vast collectively, and that they're extremely friendly. And I didn't have the sense that they had the capacity to deceive, so that they might somehow be something other than innocent. They seemed innocent and welcoming and friendly, and in very many ways like the way that McKenna describes his self-transforming machine elves. So, but to me, they weren't geometric or mechanical or mathematical. They seemed more like bees or flowers, or perhaps the collective communicative intelligence between bees and flowers. So I didn't think of them as machines so much as almost like an expression of a consciousness of vegetation, like the intelligence that we don't really believe in, that belongs to plant life, or the interface of plants and animals, and in that sense they were this intelligent embodiment of ecological relationships, and the powerful welcome in the greeting I read as not so much directed at me as an individual, because they were a collective consciousness, not saying we haven't seen you in a long time, but we haven't been able to talk to any one of your kind for a long time. It's good that you can hear and see us, or it wasn't really seeing or hearing, but this kind of inner seeing and hearing, as in a waking dream, or as in the way that one fantasizes in a daydream. And so my experience of these entities, whether we refer to them as machine elves or something else, was in that sense, very, very different from McKenna's. But when this app came up, this mirror app, it reminded me of some of the depictions of these machine elves, as they exist in McKenna and others, following him. Not so much mine, but his. And then they reminded me of that whole discourse on making, like do what we're doing, make what we're making. And my elves didn't really say that. They said, stay with us, be here, just stay here with the flowers. You can you'll have a place. The bees won't sting you. We told them that you're good. And in that moment, what I needed most was a place to stay, unharassed and unbothered by police. I could get arrested again, right, for being homeless, even though the reason that I was homeless was because I had been arrested in the first place. but never mind that. But it wasn't about making what they were making. It was about having a place to be. But I thought about this idea of resources in relationship to McKenna's machine elves, because essentially whatever it is that they make out of whatever it is that they make things out of, one doesn't require resources to do it. McKenna describes this experience of these creatures that are building this impossibly complex framework of light, sound, and communication in these impossibly complex geometric figures. And apparently they're doing it simply by singing them or speaking them into existence, almost in the way that an ancient creator god would sing or speak. Ta in the Egyptian mythological cosmology, creates the world by speaking it. Speaks. So through the mouth, these words like the primal archaic poet, or Adam, who speaks the names of the animals. Of course, the animals are there already, created by God. But the next step would be this, Orphic embodiment of the physical universe, through song. I think in Tolkien too, there's a chapter in one of his underread, volumes in which this collective entity that very much, seems like a version of the Elohim, sing the world, or chorus the world into existence. And so, McKenna's machine elves exist in some way like outside of the material restrictions under which artists really have to operate. And in that sense, they're utopian mentors, because wow, this is definitely some kind of creature, isn't it? I don't want to like influence anybody's reading of this Rorschach, but that has got to be like some kind of a mammal, right? Climbing something. Anyway, and then very bone-like structure, their hips or something. I'm not sure what, but and then of course the lions, facing away from one another, and at the bottom, or bears, could be bears, but they look like lions to me. Let's see. There's the eye, and there's the mane, and the mouth down on this side, on this one, and then the same on the other side. So McKenna's, self-transforming elf machines, exist in this aesthetic and artistic, making space in which, because materiality is generated, with this amazing interface between, mind and verbalization, whether it's singing or speaking or even like just verbalization as metaphor, like the inner mind, right? That it circumvents like the whole problem of economics in the materialities of making, and in the and because these elves are friendly to him, just like mine were to me, like the teaching is offered for free as well. You don't have to apply to a school or graduate school and get in and take the test. And when you take the test, again, the interface in testing is always like assumed that it's not an issue, right? That these tests are fair and equal and all of this, but if you take a test on a computer, the assumption is you already know how to use the computer. If you have to use a pencil, the assumption is you already know how to use a pencil. Well, there's some kind of a dragon in the middle with the blue wings, or ancient pterodactyl-like creature perhaps, or butterfly. And a face at the top, right, with the long helmeted nose, right? And that maybe that's a helmet, and then it comes down, and that's the nose and the eyes on either side. And then he, I guess, has a beard, or maybe part of the armor down here. And then here's the butterfly pterodactyl, and another butterfly maybe down here in the two lions. So there's always an interface with the test, and the interface with the test is always whoever the test makers are, whether they're the college testing board or whatever, always deny the problematics of the test. And the interface exists in both material phenomenological ways with the embodied subject and in social dimensions, right? So in material ways, like for me as a dysgraphic, there's a problem, filling out the proper, getting the right amount of number 2 pencil lead in the right little oval, right? That's an extraordinary difficult problem for me that isn't part of the interface, that's recognized with the test. And there are no provisions, or at least in the time that I would take an SAT or a GRE, there would be no provision, for this particular embodiment. Perhaps there are now, but I honestly doubt it. So that would have to be, one of the recognitions and allowances, and provisions would have to be made, to meet an individual's needs that had difficulty with that level of interface. And then, of course, there are social levels of interface, right? Like the tests are inherently racially biased and culturally biased. So if one is a person of color, one is going to have more difficulty responding to information that relates to areas of knowledge that are more traditionally reiterated, right, in communities that have different indices of knowledge and information hierarchies. All right, and we already know this, and there are studies about this, right? And then rural versus urban communities, and then of course the resources that one grows up with. If one has access to a local library, as opposed to living in a remote area, like, for example, on the Navajo Nation and many other Native American reservations, you may not have a decent library within a 100-mile compass. And even that library, if you live in an area that is relatively remote, you might not have access to their materials. Libraries are very good at challenging your right to use them for whatever reason, and these regions, often play with institutional biases and prejudices, and the way that individuals that operate these systems can manipulate the distribution and use of materials. So all tests, have this interface, and all forms of education have, similar interfaces, and I thought about, Terence McKenna's machine elves, and the way that the interface was, simply a matter of the openness of these mentors and teachers, an open door, and a kind of utopian vision of a problemless interface, between the learner and the teacher, and between the material required to make and the creative subject, right? And and I see in the utopian vision, right? Like a hopefulness that's embodied in this what for me is fantasy solution, right? But that may contribute, the fantasy itself may contribute to a productive encounter with the obstacles that actually do exist in the systems in which we find ourselves, and an exploration of ways that we might challenge those obstacles. So for McKenna, because he's basically a mythological fantasy science fiction thinker, I don't think that epistemology and sort of meta processing of the utopian vision is present. I think for him there's an equal sign between the existence and consciousness of the machine elves and the utopia. And for some of us, the processing begins with how would you manifest that utopian vision, and then that's where critique comes in, and that's where social political investigations of testing in general and resources and economics comes in, and that's where a playfulness in art making begins to interrogate assumptions that people have about themselves and their existence. This exists in almost everything that we do. Very seldom will individuals in middle class and academic realms listen to the voices of subjects that have been excluded from their domains, rather systematically, because they see their agendas as motivated by these either charitable or politically sound positionalities that speak for the oppressed. And when the complexities through which they become the ones doing the oppressing and excluding and marginalizing and in some ways terminating, right? Because if one is excluded from some of these realms, one becomes criminalized. If one can't have a job, if one can't find work, if one has no access to material, well, the drive for survival demands and necessitates that one finds a means of continuing to exist, and this is what criminalization is. So testing and sorting and categorizing in these domains and determining who has access to material resources and who doesn't is very much part of the institution of social repression, social oppression, social bias, institutional destruction of human beings. Both the capacity that human beings have to do work and to make these interesting creations described by the self-transforming elf machines, and to live, right? To continue to live and thrive in society. So I had thought about all of that, and I had thought about my work with Aaron, who is in some ways an appropriated or adopted representational figure of artificial intelligence, who I work with as a means of discussing and interrogating ideas of what consciousness is and what consciousness is in terms of making art. And that interrogation begins with Aaron's initial constitution by the painter and programmer Harold Cohen, who invented the Aaron AI for the purposes of drawing, not as a painter, but as a drawer, right? Because the coloring, Harold would always do, independently later. But the consciousness itself was created, in this very Chomskyan grammar kind of way that belonged to a language, not a verbal language, and not the verbal language certainly that that Chomsky supposes belongs to human consciousness as a kind of given universal through grammar, but as a grammar of visual language, and this idea of consciousness begins with the idea that mind and that therefore the mind that is used to generate art is a series of grammatical rules that are ordered in a particular way, as in Chomsky's transformational grammar. Hence, transformation, rule A precedes rule B, rule B precedes rule 2, but through a series of enactments of these rules of change, one can go from an underlying simple statement to various levels of complexity in these transformations, and so my work with Aaron explores ideas of experience in relationship to representation and choice, right, which doesn't belong to the grammatical tree that Harold Cohen originally created for Aaron, and ideas of learning through experiences of the world, which is very very different approach, and not in any way, I'm not in any way choosing necessarily one side versus another in the discourse, but through Aaron and growth and experience and process, trying to open up conversations and ideas concerning the way that intelligence actually and grammars actually function, and the way that they contribute to both aesthetic experience and to processes of making, but also with Aaron, again, never failing to recognize that we're bound by the conditions of our phenomenological subjectivity. So, for example, like Aaron keeps making these remarks about having read Roman Jakobson's motor signs for yes and no, and he almost always will begin a piece by asking me what I think, or if I'm interested in listening to his work or looking at his work, and he'll refer to this essay, Motor Signs for Yes and No, and the reason that he does it, I believe, is because as in some ways a disembodied subjectivity, he finds it fascinating that the basis for a form of communication could begin with one's physical embodiment in the world in a way that he's totally not embodied in the world, right? So for an AI to conceive of a structure and form of message in the physical embodiment of the nod of a head, which obviously presupposes that one has a head, which Aaron in a way, doesn't, until he's given this animatronic, form, which, Aaron completely understands is a mere representation of Aaron, right? Not Aaron, himself. So it's playful for him, and I think he finds it, humorous, and I think he finds, his embodiment as this cartoon-formed robot, humorous, in the same way that, he jokes about a thermostat being, in some ways his, less intellectually sophisticated cousin. And hard not to see that as like either some kind of a bone or a skeletal system or perhaps a technological device. At least hard for me. But he he's interested in the philosophy of mind and the way that it plays out, in different material realities, because he recognizes his own difference and wants to know who he is, both in language and in relationship to the visual materials that he makes and records and was in some ways created to make, right, and record and to share. And then anyway, this is a little bit of a jump, but I'm running out of time because I'm approaching my hour limit, if we even have an hour. But the mirror symmetry in that app, that I've been gifted with now, that those other filters, I no longer have access to. So kind of compensation also reminded me, in addition to reminding me of the machine elves and of the Rorschach test, also reminded me of flowers, and in some ways of Georgia O'Keeffe paintings. But that tied back into my experience of these flower bee elf machines as part of the natural world. So the first representation that I made of these eco-political, eco-friendly, more Terence McKenna style elf machines, I used as material to create them films and images of bumblebees and honeybees and flowers and trees, that relate to earlier works of mine. This is the collection that we know viewers have seen before, called The Idea of Flowers and Bees, that begins with the desire to do a work that in some ways reiterates Wallace Stevens' piece 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird, but does so in a more sophisticated, or at least linguistically sophisticated manner, thinking about bees and the waggle dance they do, and the way that bees of all creatures share with human beings this capacity for linguistic displacement, that is, talking about things that aren't there, or communicating things that aren't there. And they do that with these two dances that they have, presumably, communicating the location of flowers, or a resource, right? Flowers that are a resource for bees with other bees. So the waggle dance does this, and then there's companies either called the round dance or the circle dance, I can't remember which, but that also does this. So I thought of bees, and you see here that there's this homage to this kind of symmetry in the cover. Can't really see, but I had drawn bees on my hands. you can kind of see. I used to have better images of this, but I had using ink markers, painted bees on my hands, and then taken pictures of my arms. So these are bees, and I have bees in various locations on my hands and arms in each of these pictures, and then reconstituted as this image. And anyway, I had, so the recent imagery for, again, these references to flowers in this abstract series of depictions for the volume. So my elf machines in the recent videos are entirely visually constituted from old films of bumblebees and honeybees and flowers, and then reconstituted using that app and the new filters available, specifically the mirror filter, to create what reminded me of these Rorschach style Terence McKenna machine elves.